The worst thing to ever happen in the history of mankind was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And the greatest thing to ever happen in the history of mankind was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The Bible gives us some detail of what happened. He was whipped, beaten, as they call it, scourged with the cat o' nine tails. He was whipped until his ribs were exposed, his spine was showing. He had a crown made out of thorns that were about 2 to 3 inches long, driven into his skull. Common Roman practices during crucifixion were that they would defecate on the person, they would urinate on the person. He had chunks of his beard ripped out of his face. He was spit on, mocked, and ridiculed. After suffering all that, he had to hoist up a crossbeam, which would be comparable to a railroad tie that weighed about 300 pounds. And he had to carry it an extremely long distance uphill. He collapsed while carrying it. People were still mocking him, people were still kicking him, spitting on him. He had to have a man help him carry his cross up the hill. Once he made it to the top, they laid him on the cross, and they drove railroad spikes, enormous nails, through both of his hands and both of his feet, piercing through his nerves. They hoisted him up on the cross. Nerve pain probably shot up and down his arms and legs. He couldn't breathe. He had to pull himself up with his exposed muscle tissues on his back, rubbing against that splintery wood just to inhale a breath. The mockery continued. Some scholars and experts on Roman crucifixion, specifically the crucifixion of Christ, say that he was mutilated from his waist down. You couldn't tell if he was a man or a woman. He didn't appear human. Blood was coming out of his sweat glands. He was completely painted red with his blood. Given all that happened to him, the most pain that he faced was for a few hours. God turned his back on him. He was completely out of the presence of the Father. I want you guys to think about this. As bad as crucifixions were, Romans were a master of killing people. But this was Satan's one chance to take out his full wrath and his full anger upon God. What I'm saying to you is, as bad as crucifixions were, that this one was in all likelihood the worst one of all. Jesus was in complete separation from God. He experienced hell, exactly what it felt like to be in hell. And he took all that weight, all that pain, all that agony, so that you could be reconciled with the Father. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made him who knew no sin become sin, so that we could be made the righteousness of God. That means that God took Jesus, and even though he was without blemish, without flaw, without sin, a spotless lamb on the cross, treated him as though he lived your life, and then turned around and treats you as though you lived his. The debt had been paid, the battle had been won. It was finished. Christ commanded his spirit into the hands of God. 3 days later, He overcame the grave so that you can too. You are not bound to your body. You are not bound to this world. You are not bound to flesh. Christ has given you freedom, and He's paid your debt. I want you guys to think about this. Grace and justice are at opposition with each other. If a man lived a great life, he was a good man, and then one day he decides to go out and burn a house down, and he's standing before the judge, and the judge says, I know you've lived a good life. This is the only thing you've ever done wrong, but I'm going to give you life imprisonment. You'll never see the light of day again. Justice would be served at a maximum, but grace, there would be none. If the same man stood before the judge and the judge says, I know you need punishment for this. The typical punishment is 20 years. But since you've done so well in your life, I'm just going to wipe the books clean and I'm going to let you go. Grace would be fulfilled at a maximum, but there would be no justice. Now, if the same scenario takes place and the judge says, I find you guilty and I'm going to give you the maximum sentence. Let's say you get 15 years. And this man comes in the courtroom and he says, Your Honor, I know this man's guilty, but I want to take his punishment for him. I want to serve his sentence. And the judge grants it, and that man goes to jail for the maximum sentence, and you get to walk out of the courtroom. Then justice has been served, and grace has been served evenly. That's what Jesus did for you. That was not his punishment to bear. It was your punishment. That was not his cross. It was your cross. Both grace and justice were fulfilled. The worst thing that ever happened in human history and the best thing that ever happened ever was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.